Mask wearing will be mandatory in shops and on public transport in England from Tuesday. That's according to Health Secretary Sajid Javid. It follows yesterday's briefing from Prime Minister Boris Johnson as he set out new travel and face-covering measures to help combat the new Omicron variant. But it was questioning from the mainstream media, a bit too pro-lockdown. Let's take a listen, shall we?
How likely is it that those restrictions could be ratcheted up in 3 weeks' time rather than wound down? And can you say with any confidence at the moment that people can keep their Christmas plans? Have people amongst your sage advisors been pushing for full Plan B now? And if not, why not?
Have you modelled the potential spread of this new variant over the next few weeks and months? What picture does that show? And can we really rule out lockdowns?
Prime Minister, there'll be people watching this wondering why you're not going further into Plan B and ordering people to work from home, if that might help us actually have something towards a normal Christmas and reduce the spread. Also things like having vaccine passports and using the check-in apps once again. So why aren't you doing that?
Yes, a collection of people there who would be exempt from any lockdown as key workers and possibly don't have any friends to spend Christmas with anyway. It's worth bearing in mind, though, that Ofcom's note to broadcasters on how to report the crisis responsibly is thus. It reads like this, ladies and gents. In particular, we strongly advise you take particular care when broadcasting, for example, statements that seek to question or undermine the advice of public health bodies on the coronavirus or otherwise undermine people's trust in the advice of mainstream sources of information about the disease. Calvin Robinson, darling of GBNews and Conservative commentator, of course, and indeed a regular, like I've said, on this channel, he pointed out, in his opinion, that Ofcom is overtly stifling the free press. Well, look, let's have a discussion about all of this, shall we? Here to debate this is Paul CONNEW, media commentator and author, and Richard TICE as well, leader of Reform UK. So, look, thank you very much, both of you, for joining. Now, look, I'd just like to start with you, Paul, on this. Our overall question is, is the mainstream media too pro-lockdown? What do you think?
No, I don't. I think it's fairly balanced. Yes, it's true that some papers of the left are probably more inclined to be pro-lockdown and those on the right less so. But the clips you just showed was simply journalists asking the questions that the public would be asking given the opportunity. So I don't think that displayed any degree of pro-lockdown bias. It was legitimate and logical questioning.
OK, well, we'll get stuck into that, but I've got to go to Richard first, or indeed Richard first, depending on which way the camera is. Richard, what's your view on this? Do you think that our mainstream media is too pro-lockdown?
Patrick, good evening. What was interesting about those clips is that they were from the broadcasters, BBC, Sky and ITV. The subsequent questions from some of the newspapers were actually, I think, a bit more balanced, asking some questions. But the truth is that, the Prime Minister's, the first measures they're imposing are masks and the wearing of masks in shops and back on public transport. But where's the questioning about the effectiveness of masks? The evidence of masks, both scientific, clinical trials, is derisory, that they have any effect at all. And the anecdotal evidence, let's take Germany, for example, Patrick, where not only did they have to wear masks, everybody had to wear the N95 surgical mask of much higher specification and quality. And yet Germany is now seeing more than double the number of cases on a 7-day basis than it's ever previously seen. So clearly, masks make literally almost no difference whatsoever. The one study that I've seen is what's called the Denmark study that shows there was no statistical significance. So why aren't the media, Patrick, asking about the effectiveness of masks and indeed the collateral damage of lockdowns? That's what the media should be doing, is questioning the government, having learnt the lessons or not over the last 18 months about the benefit of the various measures.
All right, Richard. Well, look, Paul, I suppose one argument there is the mask side, as Richard pointed out. Another one, I was quite surprised at the fact that there wasn't a bit more questioning as to what the noises coming out of South Africa were, which were that the actual Omicron strain, as far as they can see, appears to be relatively mild and actually you don't even necessarily lose your sense of taste and smell. Also, Botswana, we were told initially it was a Botswanan variant. They vehemently denied that. And the science hasn't always been that accurate in the past. Could you see, Paul, maybe why some people think that elements of the media aren't too big on questioning the science and the fact?
Well, maybe so, but I disagree with Richard there. There are studies that do suggest that masks, although not foolproof, certainly, are of benefit. But I think what was interesting at that press conference was that Boris Johnson didn't really want to bring himself to utter the word mask. I mean, he's got his own problems about the mask issue, and and he mumbled something. In fact, which didn't really make it clear until a member of the media asked him, "Well, are you introducing mandatory masks?" And he then said yes, rather grudgingly, and then made it pretty clear that he wanted Sajid Javid to be the man making that announcement. He'd rather not have been asked that question. But at the same time, we have a situation where we don't really know Omicron's, strength and danger to us. I mean, in southern Africa, the population is very young, and therefore it's not that surprising that the effects are fairly mild. What we don't know are the effects, in Europe when we're talking about people in 50, 60, 70 and 80-year-old age brackets. It's a very different. So I think the government have to be aware, and even Boris Johnson has to be aware, that we've had two examples of delays with being exceeding in public health terms. We still have the highest death rates in Europe, and therefore I think this was a case of the government deciding this time they weren't going to be caught delaying. Now, whether this action is proportionate or not, I think it is proportionate. Whether it needs to go further is the open question. But I've been arguing that England should have adopted mandatory mask wearing for some time, just as it applies in certain conditions, as applies in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I think it's only
how
Boris
are their
Johnson's
cases doing?
libertarian instinct.
Okay, yeah, I do get what you're saying, but I think there is the case to be made, isn't it? That cases in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland have not been so dramatically lower. In fact, in many cases, the opposite actually, as a result of their mandatory mask wearing. So
it's moved in different directions at different times.
But... Of course, it does. But absolutely, look, Paul, we'll come back to you. I just want to get Richard back in here. Paul mentioned something earlier that I thought was really interesting, actually, about, in his view, they may be asking the questions. A lot of the media at these things asking the questions that the public wanted asked. Now, there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. I'm saying this as someone who's in the media, as to whether or not someone like me shapes public opinion by the things that I say or can help to, or whether or not I hold a mirror up to public opinion. Where do you stand on that? Because some people would argue that the government's approach to this by doing these press conferences can be a bit scary for people, and actually that the media focusing on things like lockdowns and further measures actually fuels some public fear. What would you argue to that?
I think that you're absolutely right, Patrick. Without question, if the media, in a sense, follow the government's measures and then ask, well, why haven't you gone further on this and that and the other, then that does fuel a sense of fear. The role of the media is to question the government. And it's perfectly reasonable to question it one way, as long as there's balance. Questioning it the other way and saying, well, hang on, Prime Minister, why are you introducing mask mandates when, take Sweden, for example, where cases are on the floor, where mercifully they have very little death rate, they've never had a mask mandate. What more evidence do we want than probably one of the most successful countries in terms of dealing with this pandemic than a country that doesn't have a mask mandate against a country that doesn't? That's what I would expect. Okay. Balanced media questioning, rightful questioning of the government, to ask it both ways, a bit more or a bit less, to make sure.
What is being asked, Richard? Richard, there have been lots of arguments on this.
Okay. All right, Richard. Go on, Paul. What you say?
Richard's speaking nonsense there. There have been lots of focus on Sweden, whose figures aren't as clear, and the Swedish social profile is different. But there's been lots of media coverage of the Swedish situation. I'm amazed that anybody says that the media is actually taking one side. There are both sides of the argument being followed and being reported on and investigated. And on this, nothing is absolutely clear. But the idea that the media, the mainstream media, is all on one side and pro-lockdown is in fact nonsense.
Can you name me a single time when anyone who's been a member of the quotes-unquote mainstream media has called for a no lockdown, has not pushed that line there, Paul?
Yes, the Daily Mail on occasions, and the Daily Express and the Daily Telegraph. There's three examples to start with.
Yeah, fair enough. OK, well, Richard, come back to that, because then, you know, what Paul said there, I think really what a lot of people were thinking when we said mainstream media was potentially more of the broadcasting wing of it. But, hey, the print side of it is mainstream as well, Richard.
There are elements of the print side that have questioned the collateral damage of lockdowns. But I certainly can't recall any broadcast media questioning the effectiveness of masks. And the simple evidence from nations that don't have mask mandates is crystal clear and cannot be denied. And there's very little by way of print media that actually questions the effectiveness of masks. And actually what they are an instrument of fear, particularly, and I'm horrified that the first thing that seems to be happening is, as of tomorrow, numerous schools across the country are imposing mask mandates on children who are the group of people who suffer mercifully the very least from this virus. And yet, once
but they can still transmit, though, Richard. That's the issue. They have parents, they have grandparents.
And Paul, there's no evidence that masks stops transmission. No evidence whatsoever. And therefore,
yes, there is evidence that effect. There are some scientists arguing one way and some the other way.
All right. Okay. All right. Paul, is there any, from your perspective now, you know, do you not think that potentially we're at risk here of being a little bit blinkered when it comes to... Look, as yet, we don't know entirely what Omicron really means. We don't have the long-term data on it. It may well turn out, obviously, that this thing is in some way more transmissible, is in some way more deadly, and I can completely understand why a government might want to end up operating slightly on the side of caution until we know that for sure. So there's no dispute about that whatsoever. However, lockdowns and increased measures do have knock-on effects in other areas of our lives, don't they? They can mean that fewer GP appointments, they can mean fewer hospital appointments, they can mean mental health crises, for example, from people being locked indoors. Are we at risk of being a bit too blinkered here and pushing potentially for greater restrictions that could do things, on top of all those things, like stifle our economy as well?
But if the worst-case scenario comes true, when we have to go into a full Plan B scenario, that's going to be very damaging anyway. So although I'm usually very critical of Boris Johnson, I think on this occasion, precautionary measures taken early make sense. Hopefully, Omicron won't turn out to be, you know, as dangerous as some scientists fear, but we've got to be absolutely certain. And I think sensible precautions taken early make sense. Hopefully it works. But if it doesn't work, we've got serious problems. And then, of course, the challenge is, will we see... I think the majority of the British people will cooperate, whatever the restrictions are. But we might get small-scale versions of what's happening in Austria, for example.
Well, you've led me. It's seamlessly done, Paul. Seamlessly done, because you've led me on to my final question for Richard, to give him the final word on this. We start with you, Paul. We'll finish with Richard. Do you think, Richard, that the vast majority of the British public would comply if there were extreme measures such as another lockdown?
It's a great question, Patrick, and I think there'll be a much greater percentage who didn't comply than last time, but I suspect that would still be less than 50%. And I think it depends on the severity, but there's many more people who feel, you know, they've done what they were asked to, they've been part of the team, they've been double vaccinated or they've had the booster, and therefore they've done their bit, and that's enough. And I think there's a greater sense that we've got to learn to live with this amongst a larger percentage of the population. But is that more than 50%? Probably not.
Look, both of you, thank you very much. This was called The Clash. It was indeed a clash, and I thought it was fantastic on both fronts. We covered a range of stuff there. Hopefully everyone at home feels the same way as well. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.